that I think all go back to the root, same cause. I would see things like nations fighting against each other and certain nations trying to create superpowers and rule over other places. And then on the flip side, I would also see tons of things like revolutionary products and ideas about how to, solve all the world's problems and make this a utopia that we live in. Those are two extremes that coexist at the same time, and they both point to the fact that there are problems in the world, and the thought is that we try to find and create answers to them. This brings up some core questions. Can human beings find solution to the world's problems? Can we fix the world? Can we fix ourselves? Can we find the answers to be able to do that on our own? Can we somehow make this an idyllic place to live in Eden? These questions and more are brought up by the story that many of us know as the Tower of Babel, which is what we're going to talk about today. In the story of Babel, we see people trying to make their way without God by doing things on their own, intent on their own self-will, but God then graciously steps in and stops their evil, and then through that finds a way to bless all of humanity. At the center, the story about the Tower of Babel really points to human pride and selfishness, which I think are probably our biggest problems when you boil everything down. So I want us to look at the core message of what we have here in Genesis chapter 11, and then take some applications about what we're supposed to learn from this story. And so be turning over to Genesis chapter 11 here. And what I want us to understand this morning at the center is that humanity cannot find its way and fix its problems without God. It's a very simple message that humanity cannot find its way and fix its problems without God. And even though we rebel and we try to do that on our own, God is still gracious and provides a way for us to be united with Him. So let's start looking at the message of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 here. So we start with Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, which note, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And to really understand what Moses is communicating to us here from the story, we need to understand some of what is being talked about in Genesis and how we got to this point. And so first in the message of Babel, we need to talk about how we got here. What is leading up to Babel? So if you understand the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, which are really kind of a unit, we're told about the world, we're told about humanity's downward spiral after its willful separation from God. We're told about the flood and the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which you'll see in chapter 10. And be looking at chapter 10. We're going to talk about this for a few moments. These records that we have in Genesis chapter 10 of all of these names and nations, the sons of Japheth and Ham and Shem, are commonly referred to as the Table of Nations, because it's recording the ancestry of the people and the nations in that part of the world. In Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 10, be looking at this. Genesis 10, 8 through 10, we're introduced to Nimrod, which is funny because in our language, Nimrod is not reflective of how he's talked about in Genesis here. You can thank Bugs Bunny for that, I think. But in verses 8 through 10, we're introduced to Nimrod, who was a mighty warrior, and he was mighty before the Lord. And it says the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh in the land of Shinar. And so that's sort of the part of the background leading up to this story, that his kingdom includes Babel, which was in the land of Shinar. And Babel and Shinar is what our passage is about here. But you look at Genesis 10, and it says the people are separated by their families and their languages. And then we move to Genesis 1, and it says that they all have one language and one vocabulary and that they're all united. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 5 is an example of this, and this is repeated 3 times in verses 5, 20, and 31. From these the coastline people spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans and in their nations. And so Genesis 11, what we have in the story of Babel, seems to be explaining the spread of the nations that happened that we see in Genesis chapter 10. Genesis 10 in verse 32, which is the end of the chapter, says, "These are the clans of Noah, the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies and their nations, and from these nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood." And so what we're being shown is that God spreads out the people and then takes one particular family line to work his plan through the line of Shem and then Abraham in particular. And so the story of Babel is a flashback to before this division in the Table of Nations happens, when people were still united and still had the same language and spoke together. And this is part of leading up to Babel. And so you see back in verses 1 through 2 that they migrate together and they come to a place called Shinar and settle. It's commonly thought that Shinar refers to the region of Sumer. There's similarities in the language there. You might have heard of the Sumerians before, and the regional name Shinar and then the name Babel leads to a probability that this is talking about the beginning of the city of Babylon, which would be in modern-day Iraq. Historically, Sumer, or the Sumerians, was thought to be the very first place of civilization, the very first recorded written language of cuneiform. And so if the link between Shinar and Sumer is correct, it really gives a lot of interesting parallels about people coming and settling and developing together and then dividing. And in that idea, here in the story, this idea of same or one is extremely important. It's a repeated word 4 times in verses 1 and in verse 6, showing that all of these people are together and they're intent on a purpose. And you see like this that they are in, I believe it is verse 6, they are one people, they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them. And if you take that verse by itself, this sounds like a great thing. That everyone is united and they're doing the same thing and they're communicating and they're working together and nothing's going to be impossible for them. But what we'll see is God says that unity in that way depends on what the purpose is. That they were united and they were together, but this was not a good thing. And we've already been shown a glimpse of God's judgment of the humans and that they seem to be singularly intent on evil, which is the exercise of their own self-will. And so before the flood, which takes place in Genesis 6 through 9, we see that it says in Genesis 6:5, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." And so God cleanses the earth with a flood. But in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 21, after the flood, when Noah is giving a sacrifice of thanks, it says, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma of the sacrifice, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. And neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." And if you look at this carefully in verse 21, God says, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, because he is always going to be like this." And so God would have to continually cleanse the earth over and over and over again because of what is in humankind's hearts. And so humanity is drifting further from God at this point, and these people are all coming together for the same purpose. And there's also an interesting detail in these verses about what they are doing and where they're going. So look carefully at verse 2. If you look at verse 2, and it says, if I get to the right chapter, verse 2, that the people migrated from the east or to the east, and they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And if you're reading the book of Genesis in one sitting, that language might sound familiar to you because this is the same general area that the Garden of Eden is found in. And in fact, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 8, the author says, "And the Lord planted a garden in the east, and there he put man whom he had formed." And the discussion of the rivers that are near the garden and all of that puts it in the same region of the land of Shinar. So that's an interesting connection. We're maybe being prodded to think, are these people trying to go back and redo Eden on their own? They're going to the same spot. They're intent on one purpose. They're trying to build all of these things together. Are they trying to do it again on their own? And let's look at what they do. In verses 3 through 4, we have their statements here of, "And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar," which is like tar. "And then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" So what did they do? The details here in verse 3 suggest maybe that there's some kind of advance in technology. They're able to start building and develop materials. They make bricks. And they say, let's make a city and a tower that reaches to the sky. And you'll note that the story is not really focused on the Tower of Babel. It's focused just on their building of the city and of the tower and what all of that represents. And most often it's thought that what's being described is that they're building, this is your $10 word for the day, a Mesopotamian ziggurat, which looks something like this, and you see in different parts of the world. Although it's disputed that this is for sure what it is. But it's suggestive because the idea is that people saw them as a staircase to the dwelling of the gods. And at the top of this temple or this tower, there would be an apartment almost for the God to live in. And maybe it looked like this, but the emphasis is not even in particular on what they're building, but just the fact that they are doing it, the building of this city and the tower in it. And when you look at this again, if you were to take verses 3 and 4 by themselves, it looks relatively neutral. They just have these plans and they're going to execute all of these things. So maybe they're coming together because they're trying to be united and they're going to do something that glorifies God. We don't really know, but what do they say their purpose is here in verse 4? To make a name for ourselves so that we won't be scattered and forgotten. And this is what they reveal their intention is. What do they intend to do by saying make a name for ourselves? If you look at this language elsewhere in the Old Testament and other places, this idea is conveyed as a reputation or fame, where someone is trying to make a name for themselves in terms of becoming famous or having some kind of prominence. And the New Living Translation actually renders verse 4 as, "This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." And that's the idea, that they are trying to establish prowess and show their greatness as human beings. And they show that in the constructing of this city, but also in trying to build this tower monument that will reach to the heavens or to the sky. And the idea of heaven is actually plural here, that they want to take it to the sky, which was seen by them as the dwelling place of deity. So this is not their building a structure in the name of a god. This is instead building it in their name. The humans want to establish their own fame and their reputation in the place of God. And so the people could have come together and they could have tried to cooperate in fulfilling God's plan and glorifying Him, but instead they try to establish their own greatness apart from God and even encroach on divine territory and say, we're going to dwell in the same place as the gods. And so the message here is that humanity continues to rebel. God has cleansed the earth, but because of what is in human beings and the exercise of their own free will, they continue to rebel against God. So we see in Genesis, the story is that the people continue in this prideful self-will that began in the Garden of Eden. They try to establish themselves without God. We see this human tendency continued, which we see even today, which we'll talk about later. But the author points to just the futility of this in some of the wordplay that happens here. And so the name Babel, or Babylon as it's translated in most other places, was first meant to communicate the idea of the gate of the gods, is what the Babylonians said it meant. That Babylon is the gate of the gods. But through God's action, he gives it a new name. And so you jump down to verse 9, as it's revealed here. And it says, therefore its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And you might have a footnote in your Bible that says something like the word Babel sounds like the word for confused in Hebrew. So the author is showing us they thought that this was some grand thing that they were building, the gate of the gods, but God turned it into confusion. And he makes a play on the words. They intended to make a name for themselves and to establish their greatness, but God intervened through confusing them and scattering them, and then the name associated with them becomes confusion. There's a lot of irony in the story of Babel. And because of this story, and moving on then, the name Babylon becomes a symbol of human arrogance and the pride of the world that is in opposition to God. It's used throughout Scripture. And so, for instance, it's used in the prophets in talking about real Babylon and its values and what they were like. And so Isaiah talks about Babylon and says, in Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. And then it's used later, even in the New Testament, as symbolizing everything that Babylon stood for. And so in Revelation chapter 18, and using Babylon as the symbol for essentially everything that's wrong in the world, he called out with a mighty voice, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons and a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, and a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. And so basically this is the idea that Babylon becomes this idea of a world superpower that then influences the rest of humanity to sin. And it all starts with the Tower of Babel. Genesis wants to see this pattern that's emerging here. The cleansing of the flood had occurred, and then God makes an eternal covenant with Noah and the earth that he will never destroy it completely again. And we saw that in verse 21, that I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. So in one sense, the flood did not work to fix the problem of humanity. And that was because of what existed in human beings. And God said essentially, for this to work, I would have to do this over and over again, and I'm not going to do that. And so he makes this covenant with Noah, but humanity still has a real problem. And so part of what is brought up in Babel and all of these occasions of the Garden of Eden and then the flood and then the Tower of Babel is God's plan for creation going to fail? Because the humans keep getting in the way. God wants to create this place for humanity to live in unity with God, and they keep messing it up time and time again. And that's part of what these first 11 chapters in Genesis show. But let's look at how God intervenes. Is Babel going to mess everything up? Let's look at what God does here. In verses 5 through 7, it says, "And the Lord came down to see the tower, the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the people were worried about being scattered and forgotten, and that's why they wanted to make a reputation. We build this, and people will remember us forever, and they'll see how great we are. And so they try by all of their power and their cooperation to establish this by themselves. And they make this great thing, and then it says, God comes down to see it. He has to stoop down even to see the greatest creation that human beings have made, to look at what the people had done. And what did God see? They're all together, and this is only what they have begun to do. And you can also say this in terms of this is only the beginning. This is only the beginning of what the humans are going to do. So what does that mean? Because does that mean that God is impressed with what they've accomplished? No, he is telling, if you look carefully at verse 7, "Come, let us go down." He is speaking to the heavenly beings with him. Look how much evil the human beings are capable of. This is only the beginning of what they are going to do. The context of the story emphasizes that humanity, by their own choice, is walking further and further away from God. And now they have come together to cooperate in establishing human greatness. And God says, in doing this in this way, there is not any kind of evil that they cannot accomplish. We've mentioned a couple times that we usually think of cooperation and unity in positive terms, and often it can be positive, but there needs to be a balanced view of that, because God says here that sometimes people are united for evil. And we can look at examples in history of genocides, or we can look at orchestrated wars or mob action or whatever, big scale, small scale. When people come together, sometimes it's for evil. And so just because a lot of people are doing it, or just because a whole nation is doing it, does not make it right. How does God respond here? God says, let us go down and confuse their language. Let's divide them so that they won't be able to cooperate in so much evil. And verse 7 should sound familiar because it's been said multiple times in this story. If we look at Genesis 11, verse 3, the people say to one another, "Come, let us make bricks." And in verse 4, they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower." So let's do all of these things. The people said, "We're going to accomplish all of this." And then God says, "Come and let's put a stop to this before it goes too far." God intervenes, and I think graciously, to confuse and to divide them so that they cannot accomplish all of their intentions. And it shows that even when human beings intend to do everything in their power, God is still supreme over that and controls it. God intervenes. And so another part of the message is that God saves them from themselves. This is part of the creation and recreation cycle that happens in Genesis. The garden he creates, and he has to recreate it after the humans have messed it up. And he recreates the earth after the flood, and now he is having to recreate the earth after Babel. And God keeps having to save us from ourselves. And we see the result in verses 8 through 9. And so the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. They didn't even complete it. And therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So this great thing, the building of the city that was going to establish their power forever, that everyone would see was left uncompleted. Because God confused them so that they could not cooperate and spread them over the known world. And we're not told how God does this. Maybe it was something that was instantaneous. Maybe he did this over time. We're not told specifically. But this is where we get the different clans that are shown to us in chapter 10 that are spread out by their languages. That they are now divided by their families and their languages and the places that they live. And there's a reflection to be made here. People are divided. And there is all of this confusion and breakdown in communication between all of us today, ultimately because of sin. The differences that exist in that way and the breakdowns in communication that happen and misunderstandings and all of that has its root in sin. And even though God scatters them so that they won't go any further, we later see, even in this book, that those separated pockets of people can still drift even further and further and do evil things. And that's what we see in, for instance, chapter 18 of Sodom and Gomorrah. Even though people are not all in the same spot, they can still cooperate to do all kinds of evil. And so those are the main messages of the story. But what does it all mean? What are we supposed to learn from this? I think the first thing, if you look at how this fits in the book of Genesis and the story that is unveiling and the cycles that go through, the first thing is that we see that God is sovereign, good, and gracious. That we're being shown some of the nature and the character of God here. So think back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, where God creates Eden, and then the humans rebel, chapters 2 and 3. And so then he cleansed the world by the flood because of all of the evil that humans had filled it with, and he made a covenant with Noah after the flood that I'm not going to do this again. And that's chapters 6 through 9. But still, humans are themselves intent on walking away from God and producing all kinds of evil. And because God promised never to destroy the earth like that again, there must be another way. He put a stop to the sinful activities of people and made it so that this here in Babel could not happen again. But there still has to be another way for God to put forward his plan. And so instead of a whole group of people, God picks instead one man to work his plan through, and that is Abraham. So if you look at this, and you just sort of do a bird's eye view, after the story of Babel, we're given the descendants of Shem, which ends up at Abraham, opening chapter 12. So the connection there is that Abraham is shown to be the way through which God is going to reverse Babel and save people. God calls him and makes these promises, and we can see in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, if we pay attention to the language, it really does have a lot to do with Babel. And now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God speaks to Abraham, and he says, "I will give you the great name that the people at Babel tried to attain for themselves. And I will bless all the dispersed families of the earth through you." And so they were scattered, but through Abraham they will be brought back together. Even through that one man, God's people are still unfaithful, which occupies most of the rest of the New Testament, or Old Testament. But God pushes through with this plan in spite of human disobedience. So do you see the lengths that God goes to save us? That there is all of this record in Genesis of how it has been messed up time and time again since the beginning. And even there, he is already planning for our redemption. All the families of the earth. how much love does God have for us to go to these lengths? Here is where the greatness of human beings is supposed to be found. God originally created them with his likeness and his image to reflect him in this world, and they mess it up. And then our greatness is not found in what we try to accomplish for ourselves and what we can build and what we can achieve, but our greatness is found in God's love for us. And through Abraham ultimately comes Jesus, through whom we can be saved through faith in God, in spite of all the evil like Babel, in spite of all of its effects. And Paul actually quotes this verse in Galatians chapter 3, 7, and 8. And he says, "Understand then that those who have faith are children of Abraham." It wasn't really because Abraham was different from all those people at Babel, but because Abraham had faith in God. And Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham, that all nations will be blessed through you. Even all the way back there, undoing Babel and then calling Abraham pointed to the gospel that God was going to bring about in Jesus Christ. All the way back at the tower. Our second point, in addition to God's character, is really a brief one, but I think it's an important one in this story. And that is that God is the God of all people. We see from this story that there's the presentation and the concern for people of all nations in the table of nations, and in the fact that the people come together and God scatters them over the world, and that God would use Abraham to bless all the families of the earth. That God is concerned with all people because they are all created in his image. He wants everyone everywhere to know him. And God does not belong to one group or to one nation. He is a universal God. There is not anyone who owns him. He does not belong to anyone, but he is the God of all people. That's one of the lessons that we're to take from this. And in addition to this, we noted that there were some parallels between the Babel event in Genesis chapter 11 and then the Garden of Eden in chapters 2 and 3. And I want to look at something there for a minute. So it's not totally clear that we're supposed to directly compare them because the author doesn't say, hey, look at these, they're the same thing. But there are a lot of important similarities to consider. And so some that we'll list here is we mentioned the location earlier. It said that the people are in the east, and God created the garden in the east. And if you look at the geography, it's in the same general area. That God comes down to see what they had done. They build the city, and God comes down. And after Adam and Eve sin against God, he comes into the garden to see what they have done. Then God speaks of action toward the humans in the plural. When he creates human beings, he says, let us create them in his image. And here in this story, he says, let us go down and confuse their language. And God explains the brokenness of human beings and the curses that he gives in Genesis chapter 3, and then in what he says in Genesis 11, verses 8 through 9, and he scatters them and sends them away from that place. And then this story closes, really, the section that the Garden of Eden began. The beginning of the world and of people. And so whether we're meant to see this all side by side, the people want to create their own paradise, independently of God. They want to rule and they want to declare their own greatness. And so as an author, Kenneth Matthews, says, that Genesis 11:1 through 9 mirrors the attempt of humanity in the garden to achieve power independently of God. So in a way, humanity at the Tower of Babel was trying to fix their own problems and to redo what had been done in the Garden of Eden, but without God. Is it really any different today? Throughout human history, we see the repetition of things that are supposed to revolutionize the world. And we can list all kinds of things, the steam engine, the automobile, the internet, whatever it is. This is going to fix everything. But what we see after all of those repetitions, when we develop more, even like these people did, the same core issues are still present. That nothing is completely solved. We try to solve this problem, and then we try to solve this problem, and this solution is going to revolutionize the world, and things get easier sometimes, but the same core issues still remain. And I think a big example right now that we all need to be paying attention to is what we see with artificial intelligence. That the promise is being made is that this is going to fix everything. It's going to revolutionize the world. It's going to fix all of our problems. And the same things have been said for all of human history. God's people need to have awareness of these kind of things. There is often in humanity a blind push for progress without any sort of thinking about what the consequences might be. Genesis shows this to us. We need to beware the narratives that our world is trying to convince us of. And I think one of the core lessons of what Babel means for us is that we cannot fix the world by ourselves. There is always going to be this voice among the human race that says, we can figure it out, we can find the solution. Maybe it's somewhere in the human brain, maybe it's somewhere in the world, even underground, maybe it's in space. And it's just not true. The solution to the problem of humanity is not in us, because the problem is in us. And the solution is not in the world, because the world is broken from what it once was. The solution is outside of us, in God. And Genesis shows us this clearly, time and time again, that we need God. We cannot create a new Eden. No matter how hard we try, if it's here or if it's on Mars, we cannot do it. And God's people need to remember the warnings that were given in stories like this, the perspective that God gives us of the world and what is going on behind the scenes. Because we have always tried to find out who we are apart from God, even when we can't. We've tried to find it in philosophy. We've tried to find it in science. We've even tried to find it in religion of who we are and what our importance is separated from God. And we cannot do it. This is what I want you to take away, if nothing else. We cannot fix ourselves, and we cannot fix this world apart from God. At Babel, we see people trying to progress in order to fix things themselves. This is the way the world looks, so maybe we'll go to a new place and we'll come together and we'll develop all these new technologies, and there's going to be the solution, and then we can show how great we are. Human beings have always been inclined to think that through their own greatness and power, whether it's technology or politics or it's development or it's by force, that we can become fine on our own. And that pattern is not going to stop. But we need to be able to see it for what it is. We may be able to alleviate parts of our suffering in the good things that remain in this world, and that is still part of God's provision. That we can use the natural world to create things like medicine, or we might find things to make our lives a little bit easier. And that is still part of God's common grace. But we cannot solve it. We believe that we can create our own Eden. We believe that we can fix this world and return it back to what it was, and we can't. Even though we try to do it on our own, even though we rebel and say, no, God, we're going to do this and we're going to figure out a way, God sent the plan in motion all the way back at Babel to save us from ourselves and demonstrate His love. What a God we have. So as we close this today, I want you to think about your own life. Are you trying to do it on your own? Are you trying to find the solution in me? If I just understand the way that my brain works, perhaps, maybe I can figure out a way to fix myself. Maybe there's something out in the world, a person, a movement, a book, something that is going to make me whole. Do you hear people telling you that the answer to your problems is somewhere out there? It's in this movement. It's in this understanding of how things work. Maybe it's in space somewhere. Are we taking in those narratives? The answer is in the God that created you. The answer to who you are and to your suffering and to what is supposed to fix the world is in the God that created you. And he came here to earth through Jesus to show you the way back. He's undone Babel and everything that happened with that, and he came and was one of us to show us the way back to him. So God's invitation to you today is to come out of this world and to come back to him. And whether that means that you need to recommit yourself in some way, or whether that means you need to talk to someone and figure out what it is you need to do, you can talk to one of the members here after the service, or I will be standing up here ready and available to talk while we stand and sing.